You ever hear of the phrase, behind every great man is a great woman? But what about the traitorous ones? Today's episode is about the Bonnie to America's founding Clyde. For those who like their treason poached and drizzled with hollandaise, we're talking about Benedict Arnold's wife, Peggy Shippen Arnold, with historian and professor Charlene Boyer Lewis. This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. Today, we are joined by Dr. Charlene Boyer Lewis, the Larry J. Bell Chair in American History at Kalamazoo College.
It's great to be here, Isaac.
Oh, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks.
So, Lynn, we're here to talk today about Peggy Shippen Arnold. And for the audience who doesn't know who that is, would you like to say who she was married to? That they might be more familiar with him.
They probably are. She's Mrs. Benedict Arnold. So that traitor, Benedict Arnold, that's who her husband was.
So can you give us sort of a brief description for those who just know the name of who Benedict Arnold was and what he may have done to become so infamous?
Infamous is the key term there. Benedict Arnold was actually a stunning general for the American patriots during the Revolution. And he was the hero of Saratoga. He was just incredibly crafty. He knew how to get men to follow him. He had really good military strategy. He was also good fighting naval battles on lakes as well as an army general. And so this guy was absolutely crucial to the Patriot War effort in the early years of the American Revolution. And George Washington considered him a member of his military family and one of his just most reliable and closest officers. So Benedict Arnold was absolutely crucial to a number of American victories for the first couple years of the American Revolution.
Yeah, I think that gets overlooked a lot because he was actually genuinely good at his job. That's why it mattered.
Right. He was incredibly good at his job. And that's why when he turned, it was a huge loss, and a huge loss to the Patriot side. And the British knew that.
Yeah. Since for the audience that may be familiar with him as just the idea of a traitor, what exactly did he do? Because, he betrayed us for the British, but that's as far as most people's knowledge goes.
Well, there's a legal definition of treason in this time period, and that's aiding and abetting or giving comfort to the enemy. And I would argue that Benedict Arnold did all of those things incredibly well when he decided to turn over West Point, the fort that he was in command of, that's up in the Hudson River Highlands, and an absolutely crucial fort to keeping kind of the American patriot cause together that the British wanted to sever. And so Benedict Arnold was happily turned over maps and turned over information and got in command of the fort, and then was ready to turn the fort over to the British and perhaps as well help them kidnap George Washington when he was coming for a visit to West Point. So he had lots of plans. He had lots of plans, and every single one of them was treasonous.
Yeah, he's like, I was trying to think about him and what I generally think about him and what I knew about him growing up. And he is really, I think, one of America's classic villains. Like in the story
yes.
of what we did. So much so that I don't know if you've seen it, there's a ridiculous animated movie called America the Movie, I think it's on Netflix.
Yes.
And Benedict Arnold's the main villain in that. Like he is, there might not be another American villain with such a sort of like a core, so closely tied to our story, because he was an American and then, flipped, I guess. But it's so funny that that's He's the ultimate betrayer in our American history.
And I mean, when I tell people I'm working on this and they say, oh, I remember that Brady Bunch episode where Bobby had to play Benedict Arnold in the school play and he was crying and didn't want to be him because, who wants to play the worst guy in American history? And so Benedict Arnold can kind of fit that bill as one of the worst Americans ever.
Yeah, it's like him and John Wilkes Booth. Sorry. Go ahead, Lynn.
Right. Aaron Burr.
That's
might
a
want
close
to throw
one.
Aaron Burr in there too. And
he might even be too much of a deep cut. Like,
right.
So I'm wondering, he's this fantastic general for George Washington, and then he just wakes up one day and says, forget this. I'm sick of the Patriots. I'm going back to the British. I mean, what happens? Why does he all of a sudden decide he's going to, completely turn face and be on, the opposite side?
Well, Lynn, it's more complicated than that.
Could it be too complicated for history?
Right, exactly.
There it is.
And it wasn't overnight. It wasn't overnight. It took him close to 2 years to kind of work his way to this what would have been a stunning event, right, to turn over West Point. Mm-hmm. He got increasingly disgruntled in the course of kind of from 1778, 1779. He had been paying for military expenses out of his pocket. Like, for instance, for the Quebec campaign, one of his most stunning victories, he paid for almost all of that out of his own money. And the Continental Congress was refusing to repay him. Mm-hmm. And he just wasn't getting the respect that he deserved. Men were being promoted above him. He did not like that. He knew he was great, and he thought he deserved to be promoted. When these people who had done less than he, right, were being promoted over him, so he wasn't getting the money he deserved. He wasn't getting the respect he deserved. And when he gets wounded in Saratoga and really kind of shatters his leg, the surgeon wanted to take it off, but he would refuse to let him do that. So he was a crippled kind of for the rest of his life. And George Washington puts him in charge of Philadelphia to kind of restored to health after his leg was really shattered at Saratoga. Mm-hmm. And so that's where he meets Peggy Shippen Arnold, Peggy Shippen at the time, when Benedict Arnold is in charge of Philadelphia.
Oh, he meets her during the war. I didn't realize that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so he's already disgruntled, right? He's already feeling left out and feeling like George Washington doesn't love him as much as he should, and that he's not getting his money back. And then he runs into the president of the Executive Council of Pennsylvania, Joseph Reed, and they despise each other. They absolutely despise each other. Joseph Reed doesn't think Benedict Arnold's good to run Philadelphia. He doesn't like him. He thinks he interacts with Philadelphians who aren't very loyal to the Patriot cause, and the Shippen family fall into that category. They weren't obviously loyal to the Patriot cause. They weren't loyalists. Lots of historians say that Edward Shippen, Peggy Shippen's father, was a loyalist and that she was a loyalist. I wouldn't say that her family were loyalists because some of her cousins joined the Patriot Army, right? Edward Shippen's cousin, William Shippen, becomes one of the leading physicians for the Patriots. So Peggy Shippen's a different matter. I think she was happy being a loyalist flirt when the British occupied Philadelphia before Benedict Arnold was there. Sure. She and her friends happily interacted with all the British officers like John Andre. Wow. And so when Benedict enters the city, he's a hero, right? He's the hero of Saratoga. She's beautiful. And he's enamored of her. And she probably helped him make that decision that treason was probably a good way to go. I don't think she's the reason for it. Some historians say that. Other historians say she's perfectly innocent and had nothing to do with it and didn't know anything about it. But I think it's pretty clear that she thought, this might be a good idea to turn over West Point and really become British and get lots of money for it.
Were they married at that point, or were they just dating?
Well,
So when
dating,
Courting,
courting.
Exactly,
I know. I'm
dating, right,
sorry.
Courting, right?
staring longingly at each other
we
from
didn't
across
date
a
back
ballroom.
Exactly.
Silently wooing.
They were. Benedict woos her in earnest. He writes her all these love letters that she doesn't know are actually word for word love letters that he had written to the previous woman he tried to woo.
Oh my.
Yeah, bad for him. He left those. Yeah, he left those letters around, right? So historians are like, "Oh my God, what a lousy guy! You just used the exact same words to Peggy that you used for this earlier woman who turned you down." But he violently woos her, and she finally succumbs to the attack, as one of her cousins said it.
Did she say violently woos her?
Yes, and they get married in April of 1779.
Okay.
And so they meet in 1778 and they get married in April of 1779. And the treason is in September of 1780.
Okay.
So pretty quick.
Right.
It wasn't like, or relatively quick. And, I guess, I don't know how long treason normally takes, but.
Right. And it's not until, so they get married in April of 1779. And within about a month or two, they send their first letter out to the British saying, "Hey, we're disgruntled.
Sure.
We might want to help you."
How in the world
what could
did
that
they
look like?
keep that letter, like that first one? How in the world did they keep that secret? It wasn't like letters were like opened all the time in transit and stuff at the time.
Right. So this is how we know they were kind of up to something, right? So they find an intermediary, a man named Joseph Stansbury, who had been a China merchant in Philadelphia. So somebody obviously the Shippen family would know, right? A merchant of elite goods. And he was already made it abundantly clear that he was a loyalist, right? That he was a good British citizen. And he was already sending information to the British. Even though he stayed in Philadelphia once the British left Philadelphia, he stayed. So Stansbury calls on the Arnolds and they give him this letter. And we have the letter. It ended up in British archives where Benedict says, I'm disgruntled with the American cause. I think we should be mending fences and we should end this war and stay British. I don't like it that the French have joined. That's another reason why people give that he might have committed treason. And so the letter ends up, Joseph Stansbury takes it to the British and it ends up going to Henry Clinton's spy master, who's John Andre, who Peggy knew.
Oh.
Right. Now, we don't think they knew he was the spy master yet because that was kind of really hush-hush. Very few people knew that John Andre was Clinton's spy master.
Right.
But that's Stansbury ends up getting the letter to Andre. So Andre writes them back and says, "Hey, we're interested." And again, this letter also implicates Peggy Shippen because in this letter, he says, we're going to use code names and she can be, Mrs. Whatever, and you're going to be Mr. Whatever, and we're going to use invisible ink, and you're going to write all the spy stuff, right? We're going to use invisible ink, and we're going to use code names. So she has a code name as well as Benedict having a code name. And then John Andre ends the letter, and he says, and, Mrs. So-and-so, Mrs. Codename, can send letters to her friend and in invisible ink between the lines, you will send information to me and ask her friend to send the letter on to me, John Andre. And he says, and you can write about the Meschianza and other things like that. Now, the Meschianza was this huge, extravagant ball that John Andre had put on before the British had left Philadelphia, that Peggy had been one of the few women honored by this ball, right? Gotcha. So when you read this letter from Spy Master John Andre to Benedict Arnold, and it says, the letter can just be including things about the Meschianza and other stuff like that, it's clear that only Peggy can write that letter. Benedict can't write that letter.
Right. Because she was the one.
Right.
She's the subject of it. It's interesting.
Right. So she's clearly involved in this.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors. It makes sense, that they would both be involved for a couple of reasons. One, it's better cover. I don't know if you've seen there's a show that was on FX a couple of years ago called The Americans. But it's about a Russian Russian spy.
Yes.
Yeah, for
With
those who
Carrie
haven't seen it.
Russell, right.
Yes, Carrie Russell, yeah.
Right.
Felicity. But yeah, it's...
Felicity gone bad.
Exactly. So for those who haven't seen it, it's a show about these two Russian spies that are married and living deep cover here in the United States. And they even have children that don't know that they're spies. That's how deep their cover goes. And it's based on a real thing, a real Russian spy ring that got blown up in New York City around 2010-ish, if you want to look up the story. But it is more believable if there's two people doing this. And it actually comes into play a little bit later when some of this stuff... My favorite part of this story is how Peggy reacts to the whole thing and that whole show. So could you explain a little bit about how they got caught in this and what the scheme was and how that all blew up in their faces and stuff?
Yeah, so it takes a while for all of this to work out. There's lots of letters back and forth. Peggy keeps passing letters on. It's clear from the when you look at the correspondence between the two sides that she's passing letters on, she's writing letters. And so they decide that, and this is a quote right from the letter, that they're going to make a concerted effort to make a great blow against the Americans. And so the decision was made that Benedict Arnold would have to try to convince George Washington to get George Washington to make him commander of West Point, because that's the fort the British want. They really want West Point so they can cut the American patriot effort in half at the Hudson River Valley. So Benedict and Peggy say, okay. So Peggy kind of works her wiles on Robert Livingston, who's in Congress, and he writes a letter recommending Benedict to become the commander of West Point. And Benedict keeps saying to George, well, I'm not ready to go back in the field yet. I know you want me to go back in the field. And in fact, George had offered him a very high command in the army. And Benedict's like, oh, I'm not ready yet. My leg still hurts. How about if you give me the command of West Point? And so George Washington says, sure. So Benedict moves to West Point in August of 1780, and Peggy joins him there about a month later with their brand new baby, Edwards, just a couple of months old. Right. So
see, the kids are part of the cover.
Yes, they're part of the cover. And so she joins him up there at West Point in a place called Robinson House, a house that they had taken from, the Army had taken from a loyalist. And so they're living in a kind of nicely appointed house across the river from West Point. And that part's key. They're not at the fort, they're across the river. Okay. And so Peggy's there, and it's all set. The date's going to be at the very end of September, and Benedict's going to meet John Andre under the cover of darkness. And they have this meeting, and Benedict gives him the map of the fort and gives him letters that include exactly how many men are at the fort. And right before then, Benedict had sent a whole bunch of soldiers out into the woods to get firewood. So there were very few soldiers at West Point at that moment, right? All part of the plan. And they also had learned that George Washington was coming for a visit. So Benedict, in one of his last letters to Andre, says, oh, and by the way, Washington's going to be here, right? He's on his way to come. So if we can get this arranged, right, ...
Oh, my gosh.
The implication is that
Washington.
they might have, right, you might catch Washington. And Washington wasn't alone. Washington was with the Marquis de Lafayette. He was with Alexander Hamilton, both of his aides-de-camps, and Henry Knox. So,
can you imagine if all of those were caught?
Right.
We would be British today.
We would be British, right. We would be British. So they meet. He gives Andre the maps and the letters with all this information. And Andre tries to get back to the British ship. And he can't because Americans have moved the British ship out of firing range. And so now he has to get across land and go back to New York behind British lines, not by sea as he had wanted to, but across land. And he does the very dumb thing of taking off his British uniform and putting a coat over it. So now that means he's dressed as a spy and not as an officer. Right. And it turns out this was Benedict's suggestion. Hey, you stick out too much in your bright red British officer's uniform, so why don't you put a coat and hat on? So he gets on his horse and he starts to go toward British lines, and some American militiamen flag him down and say, halt, who are you? What side are you on? And they notice, according to the story, his beautiful British officer's boots. Mm-hmm. And so they know he's not who he says he is. And they make him pull off the boots, and in the boots were the maps and the letters from Benedict Arnold. And he had a pass from Benedict Arnold, right? So they don't realize who they have. Mm-hmm. And so their commander sends Andre off to a different Patriot fort and sends a messenger to Benedict at West Point saying, hey, we just arrested this guy. And he has maps of West Point in his boots, not knowing that Benedict had given them to him. Only Peggy knows this. She's the only other person who knows
so there
this.
was nothing tying Andre to Benedict in his boots.
Right. He was under an assumed name. There was an assumed name on the pass, right? Mm-hmm. And so the messenger runs to West Point and tells Benedict this. And Benedict and Peggy are waiting at breakfast for George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and the Marquis de Lafayette.
This is
and
all
Henry
happening
Knox
like the same day.
All happening on the same morning.
Oh, my God.
So they're all there at Robinson House waiting for George Washington to show up. Hamilton shows up and says, Washington and Lafayette are going to be late. And Peggy says, okay, not knowing that they had found out about Andre yet. And she sends Hamilton out to pick some peaches and stuff, which is just a delightful image, I think. And so the messenger comes and delivers this message to Benedict and says, they caught this man with these maps. And Benedict knows the whole thing has blown up. Oh, no. And so he runs upstairs, and Peggy's upstairs. We can only imagine their frantic and furtive conversations of the jig is up, they're coming for me, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
He runs back downstairs and orders a horse and rides as fast as he can to the bank of West Point, to the bank of the Hudson River across from West Point, orders his men to row him to the British ship, saying he's under a flag of truce and they need to row as fast as they can. Meanwhile, the message has come that Benedict Arnold is behind all of this because Andre has told them who he was because he is honorable, right? And he's like, I'm John Andre. I'm a British officer.
He's not a spy.
This is what's happening.
Right. Like, I'm not, because that was, again, the context at the time, like, that was considered a very ungentlemanlike thing to be, like the duplicitous or whatever. Mm-hmm. So he wouldn't want to be that.
So Andre wants to make it clear that he is a gentleman and he is an officer. Right. So Washington realizes how bad this is. He sends Hamilton to charge after Benedict.
Is Washington at Robinson House now? Like
now he is.
So they're they're in the house with
upstairs.
She's upstairs. Okay. Washington's downstairs. Knox is downstairs. Lafayette is downstairs. And Washington has ordered Hamilton to get on the fastest horse as possible to go and get Benedict so they could get him and hang him, right?
Yep.
So Hamilton is not fast enough, and they basically see the British ship, which is called the Vulture. That's the name of the British ship. Sailing away with Benedict. And Benedict has left Peggy and his newborn son, couple-month-old son, upstairs to face Washington, Hamilton, Knox, and Lafayette all by herself.
Speaking of not honorable.
Exactly.
Before we move to the next part of the story.
She's not even 20 years old, right?
Wait, she's a teenager?
Wait, how old? What?
Right. She's not even 20 years old yet. Or just around 20 years old.
Before we move on to the rest of the story, I would like to point out to the listening audience that when the messenger showed up, Lynn went, oh no. Whose side are you on, Lynn?
I know. I'm on the side of the person I'm most emotionally invested in at the moment in the conversation.
Right. You're worried about Peggy. She's worried about Peggy.
I'm worried about Peggy, yes.
Peggy's just as much a turncoat as the other guy.
That's my argument, Isaac. That's right.
All right, so we can move on. Sorry, I just wanted to point out that
Dr.
Lynn Price Robbins might be a loyalist.
Right. At least showing sympathy.
Yeah.
If not,
That's right.
She's not aiding and abetting. Right?
Yes, just sympathizing.
So Peggy was, of course, worried, concerned, freaked out is I think a fair word to use here. The whole jig was up, right? The whole entire plan was coming crashing down. Right. They were supposed to get 10,000 pounds, which is a huge amount of money, right?
Right.
For turning all of this over. And so they, here they thought they were going to be committed loyalists and going over to the British, and they were going to have 10,000 pounds for doing that. And now the whole thing is just come crashing down, and Benedict has barely escaped with his life. So Peggy really is traumatized, and I think we can all understand why she would be traumatized. Historians debate a lot about what happened in that bedroom when Peggy Shippen Arnold got very emotional about this. I think we can all agree we would all be traumatized if we were left there with our baby and our husband has just fled, right? And we've got all those main revolutionary dudes downstairs ready to figure out what is happening. So I think it's not an act. I think she does completely have a breakdown. Is absolutely terrified about what is going to happen to her, what is going to happen to her child. And so she kind of starts raving and she starts shouting to Benedict's aide-de-camps about how there are irons on her head and how she sees her husband in the ceiling and she thinks they're there to murder her child. And she says, only, George Washington can save me, can save these hot irons from being in my head. So they bring George Washington to her. They take him upstairs to try to calm her down because now they're all very upset that she's so distressed and she's, losing her mind. And so George Washington comes in and she grabs her child and she says, no, you're not George Washington. You're one of the men who's here to murder my son or to murder my baby.
Oh, geez.
Right. And Washington doesn't know what to do. He's just flummoxed by all of this and leaves the room, leaves her to her housekeeper, and a doctor comes. And Hamilton's all concerned and Lafayette's all concerned. They're all worried about her. And we have letters that they write that night about how concerned they are about her, how she's just raving mad. And this is not how a lady acts, right? They're gentlemen and they know all the codes of behavior of gentlemen and they know all the codes of behavior of a lady. And so Peggy fits them in lots of ways, right? They think of her as delicate. They think of her as fragile. And this is why she has collapsed. Right. And because they think she is so much a lady and therefore she's virtuous in this time period, right? That's part of the definition of being a lady. They never once think that she has anything to do with this.
So you genuinely believe that I mean, I hate the term,
faking it?
No, the hysteria of it, was genuine.
Yes.
Interesting, because I always it's not convenient, but it is very much in line with she gets what she needs out of the situation. Right. And lots of people say, "Oh, it's the best acting job ever." Right? It was the greatest acting job ever, and I think that's making her too calculated. And I think if any of us can even try for a moment to put ourselves in her place, we might all have a freak out too. Right?
Well, now that I realize how young she was. Right. I mean, she was so young. She has a baby. Right. So if she does get hanged for treason.
Yeah, they didn't do that to women. So she probably wasn't expecting that.
So what would she expect? What would they... did they do anything to women?
Well, they did put women in jail.
Okay.
She certainly knew she was in an incredible amount of trouble.
Right.
So I think, Isaac, back to your question about, this just seems really convenient. I think she was truly traumatized, sure. But I also think, she milked it for all it was worth. Because when she regains her senses, right, she very much plays what I call the damsel in distress, right? She very much plays, this is where I'm all alone. This is all upsetting. My baby, right? And really uses this image of her as a mother. And the sense that she is this delicate, fragile lady who has come undone, right?
Yeah.
And so she calls Hamilton to come and visit her, and he comes and visits her, and she calls up Lafayette to come and visit her, right? And she has these very touching exchanges, conversations with them that they both write about in their letters. Hamilton writes to his fiancée, Elizabeth Schuyler, about how, beautiful and wonderful and delicate Peggy is, and how he would never treat Elizabeth the way Benedict has treated Peggy, right? And you're like, oh, Alex, you're so wrong.
Yeah, like no comment.
And if she was really treasonous, if she was in cahoots, why would she want them close to her? She should be hiding from them, right? It's that. So that part is, or at least feels calculated in your estimation, like that.
Right. So I think some of this is calculated. Like, oh my gosh, I am in this situation now. How can I make the best of it? And the best of it, I would argue, is what's best for me and my child.
Right. Because
when she finally kind of regains her composure, Washington, it's about a day and a half, 2 days later, says to her, I will let you go wherever you want to go. I will give you escort. Do you want to go to Benedict behind British lines in New York City? Or do you want to go to Philadelphia and be with your family? And she chooses Philadelphia. She doesn't choose him.
Well, he did run off.
right. Yeah, I like to think that she's like really pissed at him, right? And really mad. We don't know. She left nothing behind about what happened. She never wrote about it. He never wrote about it.
Who knows what happened when Hamilton was off in the garden picking peaches? That conversation,
right. But she chooses her family. And so she gets escorted back to her family, and nobody once asked her anything about any of this. She was never ever treated. She was never treated as anybody who would know anything until she gets back to Philadelphia.
Oh, and then it changes.
Right. And then Joseph Reed says, I don't trust her. I don't trust her at all. And General Nathaniel Greene says, writes a letter to George Washington, and he says, you need to get somebody to the Arnold house as soon as possible in Philadelphia, and you need to grab all of their letters, all of their correspondence, including any of the Shippens. Right.
That's interesting.
And so Nathaniel Greene totally sees that she may be a part of this. And Joseph Reed is convinced that she's a part of it. So when she gets back to her family, he and the executive council of Pennsylvania say, nope, you can't stay here. We order you exiled. You are exiled out of the state of Pennsylvania. You have 3 weeks to leave the state, and you are never to return until the war is over. So her family thought she could stay. And they said, no, that she was a threat. She was a threat to the state and a threat to the cause, and she was exiled from Pennsylvania.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
Yeah, that's interesting that Nathaniel Greene was the one that kind of because he wasn't there at the thing, so he didn't see the thing, so he doesn't have like the emotional experience of seeing her in that traumatic experience driving it.
Right. But he becomes the next commander of West Point. So he becomes the commander of West Point. Right. Greene does. Right. Just temporarily. But they had to get somebody in charge.
I also think it's interesting that Joseph Reed, out of all the people who was suspicious of them, because he wasn't exactly like a Washington fan either.
No.
Right. He's an interest. Yeah. Him being like the central to this is an interesting fact. He has a whole, history. He was at Washington's aide de camp and ended up sort of like trying to subvert some of Washington's plans.
But he is a super Philadelphia patriot.
Right.
And so he was always dubious of anybody who wasn't a super patriot. Right.
Right.
So did Peggy's family, they didn't know, but were they suspicious of her? Or were they just supportive and it was everyone else in Philadelphia?
Well, that's a really good question, I think. They write things at the time that make it sound like they don't think she had anything to do with it. However, and this is the historian looking back, I can, make judgments like this. However, there is not one scrap of paper left that Peggy wrote in that time period to any of her family members.
Yep.
And there's lots of letters after once she's back in England, but for this whole, from her marriage until the mid-1780s, It's all gone. There are no letters to her. There are no letters from her. There is nothing, which makes me think.
I smell a cover up.
Right, right, exactly. Now, it may not be that they're covering up
or
information.
Just, yeah.
Right. I mean, she wouldn't write to her dad, hey, we're going to turn over West Point. Right. But I think they were so concerned about her reputation, their family's reputation, that they got rid of anything that anybody would have the slightest, bit of information that might look bad. Because when they do storm into the Arnold's house in Philadelphia, they do get some letters, and they publish one from Peggy written to Benedict in the newspaper. And it doesn't say anything treasonous, but she's really snarky about some leading women in Philadelphia. Like she says kind of snarky things about them and the way they dress. And that gets published, right? To show how she's not.
So it's like a trashing the reputation. That's such a using the media to like paint a picture of someone that has nothing to do with the subject at hand. It's like, oh, but look at it. She's talking behind your backs. She's got to be. She's totally in on it. That's so funny.
Exactly. So I think that's when her family was, oh my gosh, like we got to get rid of everything, right? Because it's all gone. It's all gone.
Huh. So she's exiled.
Right? Yep. And her dad takes her to New York City, and she joins Benedict.
Oh, so he's hanging out at New York.
He's hanging out with the British in New York City.
Okay.
Right. He's soon given command of some troops down in Virginia, where he burns a whole bunch of plantations and commits lots of bad things in Virginia. They don't like him in Virginia. And yeah, I mean, he really becomes a true diehard British officer the minute he turns over. There's no question. He's all in and starts killing Americans.
But not a werewolf, like in that animated movie. Right, okay. Just to be clear.
George Washington's the werewolf.
Washington's the werewolf?
Yeah.
No.
That's another book.
I'm sure, I'm sure Arnold in animated is partly werewolf. Anyway,
they all
sorry.
are.
Right.
So what was I going to say? Oh, yes. So obviously Benedict Arnold's issue is that he is not loved and admired and showered with praise by his commanders. Was he when he went to the British? Were they like, oh boy, you've come to us, we love you, we'll pay you whatever you want? And did he get what he wanted, basically, after he committed treason?
He got a lot of what he wanted, but he didn't get everything he wanted.
Okay.
He only got 6,000 pounds instead of 10,000 pounds because he didn't come through on the deal.
Okay.
The British Army, and especially Clinton, was incredibly... It was tragic for them that John Andre got hanged. They loved John Andre. Everybody loved John Andre. And Benedict Arnold didn't have the charisma of John Andre. So they were disappointed that this whole thing didn't work and they lost Andre. But again, a lot of historians wrote about Benedict Arnold and said, oh, they shunned him, they didn't like him. That's not true at all. They knew he was a very capable commander. They give him commands. Now, they don't give him as high up of a rank as he wants. He's thwarted, right? And Clinton kind of writes to other officers and says, well, let him do stuff, but keep an eye on him, right? Like, he has to ask your permission if he wants to keep doing this. So he's a little, he's not given as much respect as probably that he wanted. But when he goes back to England, both he and Peggy are presented at court. He has lots of Lord Cornwallis stays a very good friend of Benedict Arnold's for the rest of his life.
Oh, wow.
So does Henry Clinton. He also pals around with a number of aristocrats. King George III talks to him in person a number of times, invites him to some kind of war cabinet meetings. Sure. So he's not the shunned person that many American historians in the 19th century especially wanted to portray him as, right? Because they want him to be the villain that Isaac said, right? That he's the worst American villain. He's the werewolf. And so they want him to be shunned and spit upon, right, when he goes to England. And that just doesn't really happen. And Peggy becomes quite popular in England. Her beauty is written upon in the newspapers about how beautiful she is. Like I said, she's presented at court. She becomes very good friends with a number of aristocratic women. They are kind of the center of loyalist communities in London. They have lots of very good friends. All the loyalists kind of move together in the same neighborhood, and they have lots of very good friends there. So it's not, the story that some historians told. They go back to Canada, and they live in Canada for a while, in New Brunswick, and Benedict's a failure there.
That's punishment enough.
Right.
Oh.
It's beautiful. I've been there. I did research there. And the funniest thing is that people in New Brunswick think Benedict Arnold's great, right? Because he was this wonderful loyalist.
Of course they do.
And he did all the good things, right? And so there are plaques. There are plaques like, here's Benedict Arnold's house. And, here's Benedict Arnold here. Yeah.
Oh, my God.
It's very funny to see that. That they're, lauding Benedict Arnold and the other loyalists who came to St. John's, New Brunswick, and started that city. So he just kind of never is the success he wanted to be. He fails as a merchant. He keeps offering himself to the British Army officers and British naval officers as they go on to fight other wars, and they're like, "No, we don't need you. No, we don't need you." Right?
It makes sense that the military would be suspicious of him. Because that was what he did was ungentlemanly. It was unbefitting of an officer to turn coat, right? Why would they ever trust someone whose morals they couldn't theoretically at a certain level,
But they also saw it as a very loyal act too.
Sure.
That it's kind of the epitome of being a loyalist he lost all his property, right? He lost tens of thousands of dollars worth of property when they did this. But they both, and this is again how we know Peggy was a part of this, they both get very generous annuities from the crown, and she gets one separate from him. She gets £500 a year.
So like a pension. It's like a pension?
Right.
Okay.
Right. It's like a pension for her, as Clinton calls it, her meritorious services.
Oh.
And when Benedict writes a couple years later asking for an increase in their pensions, because he always wants more money, he says, she deserves this for the hazards she run. That's in a letter that he writes, the hazards she run.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
and that's Revolutionary War speak.
Yeah.
Right? Yep. For doing really dangerous things. It's not just for being a supportive wife.
Given all that, so when Pennsylvania kicks her out, just to step back a little bit, was she a danger? Would she have been if she was still there? If they basically bought the story, they were like, "Oh, you had no idea. He was doing this all behind your back. What a terrible husband. What a terrible patriot."
Well, she says when she gets back to her family's home in Philadelphia, she says, "If you just let me stay here, I promise I will not write him and I will not accept any letters from him."
Okay.
So I think this is very interesting. And when I haven't started writing that chapter yet, but I really want to explore, what does this mean that she's basically willing to self-divorce, basically, right? To totally cut herself off from Benedict Arnold and say, I won't accept his letters. I won't send him letters. And so they're trying to do everything they can to show she's not a danger.
Right.
And they just don't trust that even. They're like, no, it's already the sense. They said this is treason of the blackest dye. That's what they kept saying about what had happened at West Point. And you can find that phrase everywhere, treason of the blackest dye. And so because she's Mrs. Benedict Arnold and not just Peggy Shippen, she's a danger, regardless, right? She's a danger, and so they want her gone. Yeah. Right.
And so do you think they were equating her self-separation from Benedict Arnold as also removing herself from her loyalist tendencies? So the fact that sort of that was her only connection, because when Isaac was talking, I was thinking, well, now she's going to find another loyalist to write letters to. And
she's there's the China merchant guy or whatever. He's still there, right? There's still other people.
It's like, forget Benedict, but I'm still going to help out the British,
I don't think that was in her head. One of you asked me if I thought she was a spy. And And I loved that question because I've been thinking about it ever since you asked me that question, 2 weeks ago. It's like, was she a spy? Would I say she was a spy? Like, I'm really playing around with this idea. And I decided, no, she's part of the treason.
Mm-hmm.
She's a traitor, but I don't think she's a spy.
Okay.
Because she wasn't looking for the information to pass on. She certainly helped move information, but she didn't go out to find information.
Right.
And so I think she just had very flexible loyalties. And Lynn, as you know, lots of Americans in this time period had very flexible loyalties.
Absolutely.
And going back and forth between both sides. So she was happy to be a loyalist flirt. She was happy to be a patriot bride. She was happy again to go and be a loyalist traitor's wife. And then she knew she was a committed loyalist, right? Once the jig was up and they lost out, there was no going back. And I think maybe she thought when she got back to her family's house in Philadelphia, she might have, for that little moment thought, I can go back and I can just be, I don't have to be the loyalist traitor's wife. I can just be my father's daughter.
Right.
And which is very much an 18th century sensibility, right? You're either somebody's wife or you're somebody's daughter.
Absolutely.
And I think she thought, I can just become my father's daughter, which will leave me here and leave my baby protected.
Right.
Right. And the executive council was having none of that.
But Joseph Reed would have thought that she was a spy.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. At least undeserving of any sympathy. That's for sure. That's for sure. But she and Benedict seemed to mend whatever rend might have been in their marriage. They go on and have a number of more children. And
she sticks with them through,
Yeah, oh yeah. And
Even
she
in
writes
Canada.
about how even in Canada, though he goes out to Canada first without her and has an illegitimate child.
What?
Right, which she doesn't find out about until much later.
Right.
I know, he's a rat.
What?
I mean, Benedict Arnold is, I know. He's such a Benedict Arnold. I know.
Right, exactly. Can't say loyal to anything. That guy.
Right, exactly. But there are letters much later in their life about, how he's the best of husbands and how happy she is. And so they seem to have made it work.
Interesting.
Well, I think what I want to talk about a little more, so we're talking about, Peggy and Benedict Arnold, but you're actually writing a biography of Peggy.
Yes.
So
because
I think we want to know
don't really
a little
care
bit
about Benedict.
Right? I mean, he did some things, but we want to know about Peggy.
Right.
So, so why, I guess my question is, why did you choose to study her? And, what did you know beforehand? Because I didn't know that much. And apparently some of the things I knew were false because you've corrected some things. So,
oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. That's my
coming
job.
into this, what were you thinking of?
I had written a book about another woman behaving badly to, rip off Laura Thatcher Ulrich's term about women behaving badly. Seldom, they're the ones who make history.
Well-behaved women rarely make history, right?
Right. So I'm looking for the ones who behave badly. And I had written a book about a very badly behaving woman named Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte. And she was wonderful, right, to write about because she, just flaunted all sorts of conventions. And, she marries Napoleon's youngest brother. And she wears very thin, scantily clad clothing, right, and attracts attention in Washington, D.C. She was so much fun to write about because she behaved badly.
Right.
And so when I was looking for my next book topic, I kind of tried on lots of different women and they were behaving too nicely. And so they were boring. And I was trying to look for some other woman who was behaving badly. And I wrote an article about one, a 16-year-old girl who runs away with her father, Luther Martin, law assistant, and she runs away and there's a paper duel. And so that was kind of cool, but it wasn't a book.
Right.
And so I was trying to find another badly behaving woman. And, I just kind of started thinking, okay, who's out there? Like, who do I know who kind of might be not very good? And Mrs. Benedict Arnold kind of came into my mind. And it was also at the time, and I don't know if any of you guys watched this, when Turn was on AMC.
Yep, absolutely.
Right? And I loved that.
Yep.
That's like my biggest history crush was on John Andre, right? In Turn.
Yeah.
Right. I know. Like, yeah. John Andre.
I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah, come on.
And so when I saw how she was portrayed, I thought, oh, she would be great. What a great woman to write about. And then I thought, for sure, there must be a ton of scholarly biographies on her.
Right.
There are 0 scholarly biographies on her. And there are only a handful of popular biographies on her. And so I thought, okay, here I go.
Time to fill that void.
Right. And I discovered, part of the reason why there's not a scholarly biography on her is that she just didn't leave a lot of letters, especially anything before like 1785 or so.
Right.
And she dies in 1804. So she doesn't have a really long life.
Oh.
She dies of uterine cancer in 1804, and she's just 41. But this needed to have been, my third book. This is a hard one to write because there's not a lot of sources. How do you write a biography about a woman who's not really there?
Right.
And so I have to kind of fill in all around her. But she's an incredibly good story, right? It's a great story. Just kind of from beginning to end, she's a great story. And so, I'm filling in where I can and trying to tell the most accurate story I can, which means pulling back the layers of way too many 20th century historians who have relied on 19th century historians who haven't gone back and looked at the actual sources and the actual evidence. And, trying to peel back all those layers and put her at the center instead of Benedict. She's never been at the center. She's always on the side.
Right. And she deserves to be in the center.
Right.
That's a huge task.
Yeah, it is, especially when, there's not as many sources there as one would want. But she's a traitor, right? I mean, that's the ultimate in behaving badly. So it's been a lot of fun so far. And I'm just starting writing now. COVID slowed me down in terms of getting the research done.
Oh, sure.
So fingers crossed. It's already under contract with Norton. And it's supposed to come out at beginning of 2026, just in time for 250th anniversary.
Right. Oh, that's
great.
So exciting.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we can drum up some excitement for it in the interim.
Right. And have to have me back when it comes out.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have to save some stuff for that conversation.
Right. Anything more I find out. And what's been really fun, I just got back from a trip to Provence where I met some Benedict and Peggy Arnold descendants.
I was going to ask about their kids if they,
In Provence.
And they're very interested in Benedict and Peggy, very much interested. They had some letters that nobody else has, right? They're their own private collection of Benedict and Peggy letters that I got to look at sitting in Provence. It was amazing.
That's so cool.
But they're this wonderful family who just are incredibly interested in their ancestors, very interested in why Americans think about Benedict and Peggy the way that they do. Why do we all hate them? Basically, is what they're asking me. They were just wonderful. They were absolutely wonderful to meet. And for a historian to actually sit in the room with descendants of the people you're writing about,
it's the closest you can get to talking to your subject. And that's crazy.
It was amazing. It was an amazing experience.
That doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I think there's a couple of other people that we've heard this from, but I genuinely think a lot of new discoveries as far as American, especially from the founding era, scholarship, they're all those sources, they're in Europe. Like there's a lot of desk drawers and a lot of archives over a family archive specifically that have just a ton of stuff that's just waiting to be discovered. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next, couple decades or whatever, like that's where a lot of the major things are sort of uncovered. But
as long as they don't throw it all away. That's my concern.
Right.
Yeah, we have to get over there before they have time to throw it away.
Yeah.
Right. Because this descendant who I was talking to, his grandfather was very concerned about when Christie's or Sotheby's sold some Benedict letters that they didn't want Americans to get a hold of them because Americans were already bad-mouthing them and they didn't want Americans to have them, right? So they bought them and they stayed within their family.
Oh, the family bought them from Christie's when they went for auction.
Right.
Oh.
Right. Yeah, the Arnolds bought them so that Americans couldn't get their hands on them and still say mean things about their ancestors. So it's really fascinating.
So
it's
how
really
did you sweet talk them, Charlene, into getting to see those letters and to visit them?
I got a very nice email introduction from Stephen Case, who has written a popular biography of Peggy.
Okay.
And so he had met this Arnold descendant because he had done all the genealogical research to find the descendants. I did not do that. He did that and reached out to all of them and asked if they had anything. So he had seen some of these letters and had met Hugh Arnold is the descendant's name. He's a photographer, a wonderful photographer. And So I had this introductory email and I asked Hugh if I could come over. And this, of course, was supposed to happen 2 years ago. And he said, yes, I have lots of things. I'd be happy to go. He was so welcoming. He was so generous, really happy for me to be there. Understands that this is a scholarly history. So, I'm not just going to say, oh, he was great, right? Benedict was great. But they were very generous and very honored that an American historian had traveled all that way to visit their family and spend time with them and look at their papers. And I was honored in turn that they were willing to let me do that. And just their generosity was remarkable.
Well, and I think the thing is, you're not looking to bash anybody. You're just looking for the facts.
Right.
You're looking for the truth. We don't use the true, but you're looking for the most accurate story possible.
And accuracy and complexity is what I would say, right?
Yeah.
The story for so long has so much just been about Benedict, right? Pages and pages and pages and pages about Benedict and the treason, with just this, like I said, side note of Peggy. And you have to make it a story about both of them. Right. You have to make it a story about a couple, a married couple, and not just a disgruntled general. It's got to be about a married couple. And that shifts the focus, right? So it's not just about a battlefield. It's now about a family, a home, a bedroom.
It changes the story.
A peach tree.
Peach trees, right.
Hamilton picking peaches will just always be in my mind bank now.
I say it rewrites the American Revolution, and I believe that.
So
when we do that.
One more question, because you and I, Charlene, we both do women's history. We both like the study of women and to sort of tell their stories. So Peggy, I'm wondering, do you think she fit into sort of that era's womanhood, sort of we have the idea of Republican motherhood. Do you think that she was like other women of her era? What about her was unique? What about her sort of was just part of her being a product of her era? Just can you give us a few comparisons of her, sort of an overview?
Well, I think she's very much a product of her era. She very much acted like an elite woman should. She responded in ways that elite women should. She was a very loyal wife, a very supportive wife. If Benedict had stayed a patriot, she would be right up there, with Martha Washington and Abigail Adams and Catherine Greene as these loyal patriot wives.
Right.
But they made the decision not to do that. So in the fact that she's a traitor makes her incredibly unique. But the way she was a wife, the way she was a daughter, the way she was a mother makes her like so many other elite white women in that time period. So she's very similar to lots of other women, except for that moment in September of 1780 at West Point, right, where she becomes a traitor. And I think she's a lot like other women during the Revolution as well, that throughout the Revolution, she's making choices.
Right.
Just like lots of other women did.
Right.
They weren't passive spectators. They were all active. They were all making choices about what was good for themselves, what was good for their family, what was good for their children. Did I want to be patriot? Do I want to be a loyalist? Women were making choices. And through Peggy, we can see that. And that's why I also kind of really wanted to write this book about her so that we can see women as actors in the revolution and just as much making choices and having an impact on the revolution, because we could argue that Peggy Shippen Arnold is one of the most influential women of the American Revolution, right? Because of that potential West Point treason that would have made us British, right?
Right.
Yeah.
For sure.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Well, Dr. Boyer Lewis, I would like to thank you for spending time with us today.
This has been so much fun.
Yeah, glad you enjoyed it as well.
We can't wait for your book.
Me neither.
I'm ready for it.
Write faster.
I know. Go right.
So for our audience,
give me a 5-year sabbatical and I'll take it.
We'll do what we can.
Yeah, we can finagle that. I'll call Kalamazoo. But for those our listeners that want to follow you, is there anywhere they can find you or follow your work or updates on your project? Do you have social media? Do you have a website?
I don't do that social media thing. I'm still so out of it. But if anybody has any questions or any comments, they can just email me at my Kalamazoo College email, and you can get that through my Kalamazoo College website.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much
fun.
for teaching us about Peggy.
Thanks for asking.
Thank you for listening to the full episode of Too Complicated for History. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please leave us a review on Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms at 2C4H_podcast, or check out the link in the description. This will keep you in the loop for show updates, new episodes, and exclusive content.
Too Complicated for History is a podcast from Primary Source Media. Produced by Patrick Long and Lynn Price Robbins. Edited and mixed by Curtis Fritsch. Opening theme music by Sheena Biratella.